Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Danilo Petranovic. I work here at the Abigail Adams Institute. I will briefly introduce our work, and then I will introduce our convener and also the organizer of this event, Gabby Landry, who will then introduce all of the wonderful sponsors of this event and the main speaker as well. So the Abigail Adams Institute is an independent institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. One of our major missions is to ask big questions, induce undergraduate students to ask those questions as well. There is no bigger question, arguably, than what is meaning and where do you find meaning? So I'm absolutely delighted that we are doing this event today on that big question. For more of our work, you can check us out at www.aaicambridge.org. I'm delighted to introduce Gabby Landry, who I've known for over 3 years now. Gabby, can read her bio on our student fellows page. She's also a student associate at Abigail Adams Institute, which is a great distinction of our institute. We only have 2 student associates and over 25 fellows. Gabby, as you can see, majors in philosophy and education here at Harvard and does all those other wonderful things you can read up in her bio. But I just wanted to say a few personal things about Gabby. Gabby is also become a friend over the years, and Gabby came to us as a high school student first, right, I think after she was admitted into Harvard. So we've known her for a while. She attended our summer seminar and has really been a leader ever since she came through the doors. Gabby has also run a series similar to this one at her college, at her house, I should say, Quincy House at Harvard. I think the title was a little different, but it was really asking some of the same questions that you'll hear today. And Gabby will probably be back running something like that in the fall term when we're all, God willing, back on campus. So before I hand it over to Gabby, I'd also like to thank the AAI team, Ms. Emmalyn Town, who's our operations director, who also helped initiate this event with Gabby, and Mr. James Capuzzi, responsible for our marketing. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy today's event. And Gabby, take it away.
Thank you so much, Danilo. And hi, everyone. Welcome to our event, Finding Meaning at College, a conversation with Emily Esfahani Smith and Matthew Lee. As Danilo mentioned, my name is Gabby. I'm a rising junior at Harvard studying philosophy and education, and I'm a student fellow associate at the Abigail Adams Institute. So please allow me to introduce today's guests and the sponsors of our event. Emily Esfahani Smith is a writer, editor, and speaker. Her book, The Power of Meaning, an international bestseller, has been translated into 16 different languages. The former managing editor of The New Criterion, Emily's articles and essays have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and other publications. She has also appeared on NBC's Today Show, CBS This Morning, and NPR. In 2019, she was appointed Journalism Fellow at Yale University. As a speaker, she has delivered dozens of keynotes and workshops at major corporations, universities, and conferences across the country, including TED. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Emily. Matthew Lee is the Director of Empirical Research at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard and a lecturer on sociology at Harvard College. I was lucky enough to be a student in one of his classes a couple years ago. His current research explores topics such as benevolent service to others, the integration of social science and the humanities, and the effect of character virtues on adolescent desistance from delinquency and addiction. His most recent scholarly work is Measuring Well-Being, which is available as a free download at Oxford University Press. Thank you for joining us, Matt. Our generous sponsors for this event include the Harvard University Department of Philosophy, the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University, the World Youth Alliance of North America, and the Abigail Adams Institute. Thank you so much for your generosity and support of our event today. The format for today will be as follows. Emily and Matt will engage in a conversation about finding meaning at college, and then we'll jump right into audience Q&A and discussion. As this event is geared towards undergraduate students, student questions will be prioritized during the Q&A, but we welcome all to participate. As mentioned before, this event is being recorded, so you're welcome to leave your cameras off if you wish, but only the speakers will be spotlighted in the recording. Please also remain muted until the Q&A portion. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Matt to kick off the conversation with Emily. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabby, for that warm welcome. And I'm delighted to talk with Emily today about her book, The Power of Meaning, which I used in an honors class a few years ago at my previous university, the University of Akron, with students, and they absolutely loved it. And especially the focus on connecting with the 4 pillars of meaning, which they could apply in their own lives immediately in college, to connect with a deeper sense of meaning and purpose. Emily, I wonder if we could start with the reason why you got into this topic in the first place. And I will note, as Gabby and I were reflecting on the book, at the very beginning, you set the scene in your house, which was a Sufi meeting house, which is a very warm environment. And you contrast that with the study of philosophy at an Ivy League college, which was perhaps a little less warm. And so, why start with that fundamental warmth, and why get into this topic of meaning in the first place?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to the Abigail Adams Institute and all the co-sponsors for opening up this conversation, and all of you for being here. And Professor Lee, thank you for doing this event. So, I came to the topic of meaning as a result of a few different experiences, but certainly some experiences that were grounded in my childhood, which, as you were suggesting, were, very, it was kind of a warm and enchanting and unusual childhood, very spiritual childhood. I grew up living in a Sufi meeting house. And for those who might not know, Sufism is the spiritual branch and practice of Islam. So the poet Rumi was a Sufi. The whirling dervishes are Sufis. Those are sometimes some popular touch points. And so what it meant living in the meeting house was that twice a week, these spiritual seekers, these Sufis, would come to our home, and they would sit in a large room with no furniture in it, and they would meditate for several hours, kind of think of a Buddhist Sangha type environment. And the values that they practiced, these are values that cut across all the different, world and spiritual traditions of the world. But I saw them kind of very directly in action living in the meeting house, where things like loving kindness, service to the community, kind of turning the volume down on your own kind of urges and ego in order to serve something bigger than yourself. And I think that those ideas really stayed with me when we eventually left Canada and came to the US, and we're no longer living in the Sufi meeting house. And once I kind of entered into much more conventional type of adolescence, going to a high school in northern New Jersey, where people were very focused on kind of getting into the right college and career minded, I began to yearn for, this question of what is it that makes our lives meaningful? Is it really about kind of, where you go to school? That my childhood suggested it was something very different. And so I, thinking that philosophy was the place to tackle some of these questions, I majored in philosophy at Dartmouth, where I went to college, and was really surprised that philosophy departments today, at least, certainly this was the case at Dartmouth, and I think it's the case at many philosophy departments in the US and in England, they don't really engage with those big questions of human existence anymore the way that they used to, the way that people like Aristotle and Plato and the medieval philosophers, and even some of the modern philosophers did. And that kind of left me, hungry and yearning even for more. And, one of the questions that was with me during that time, I think because of the legacy of my spiritual childhood, was, do you have to kind of come from some kind of spiritual or religious background, or have that grounded in your life in order for your life to be meaningful? Certainly the philosophy department, as kind of a secular stronghold, wasn't engaging with those questions. So I became really curious what secular bodies were. And this eventually led me to the field of positive psychology, where these big questions have kind of been picked up from philosophy. And so that's kind of a little bit of the story of what ultimately brought me to this topic.
That's great. And given what you've learned in the process of researching the book and now talking about it all over the world, what would you want to tell your young college self just starting, in the first year about how to navigate college and how to find meaning? I mean, obviously, I think about the 4 pillars of meaning that you draw out in the book, but what advice would you give to your younger self looking back now?
Mm-hmm. I think, what college is such a special time because it's really probably the only time in your life, especially if you don't go on to get some kind of advanced degree, that you can really kind of engage in learning kind of the greatest things that have ever been taught and said, and taking classes that just kind of truly interest you and maybe could stoke some passion, exploring your curiosity. And I think a lot of people get to college and think that they should major in something like economics or something that has some kind of practical utility to it. But my experience has been that, especially if you're graduating from a really good school, that what you major in doesn't actually affect your job prospects the way that you think it will. And what's far more enriching is to just study the things that you actually love, and that might actually pay off even more for your career later. So I would say not always kind of giving into the expedient thing. And I'll just have a quick example from my own kind of journey, which is when I ended up majoring in philosophy. And then my senior year, when I was trying to decide what to write about for my honors thesis, I was originally going to write about Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, and kind of something about meaning. Not even really consciously aware that I would go on and pursue a career that engaged with this kind of issue. I thought I'd go to law school or go into international relations or something. And last minute, I decided to change the topic because I thought it wasn't going to kind of on my resume be practical enough for grad school or something like that. And I ended up writing about just war theory. And the ironic thing is that if I'd actually written about what I wanted to write about, it would have been far more useful to me now than what I did write about.
What's a lesson from Kierkegaard that you might want to dig in more deeply, or perhaps even share with us today? What appeals to you about that approach as opposed to some of the others that you saw?
Well, I mean, I think what, Kierkegaard and all of the existential philosophers are really engaged with, with what I think really matters most, which is kind of asking yourself, why are we here? What kind of life that we should lead? What kind of life should we lead? And I think, Kierkegaard specifically says that the point of existence and kind of, leading a truly good life is about becoming that person who you really are. And that idea really resonated with me because, on the one hand, it sounds really simple, but then on the other hand, who are we really? To what extent do we know ourselves? And that is kind of the ancient question of philosophy. It's what set off Socrates, know thyself. And so I think college is where that kind of process of self-discovery can begin. And, I write a lot about psychology, and developmental psychologists talk about how kind of early adulthood, emerging adulthood, your primary job during that period of life is figuring out who you are and what you want to kind of give of yourself to the world. And sometimes I think that we can forget that is what we're supposed to be doing when we're so focused on getting good grades or this and that.
When you were in college, if you could think back to your college classes, think back to your extracurricular activities, think back to your friendships and the conversations you had with your family. How did, in what forums did you have these conversations to better clarify who you are? Was this happening everywhere, or was it more prominent in some areas of your life and less so in others?
I'd love to hear from other students, during the Q&A about what their experience of this is, but I feel like I didn't have any venues where these questions were being addressed in a serious way. Certainly not, I'm trying to think, I don't think any of my classes really kind of picked up these questions of, who am I and what should I be doing? And I think that's part of why I was so moved to write this book, and why I've gotten involved in kind of other organizations, one of which I can talk about in a second, which is trying to kind of create spaces for people to kind of talk about these big issues, because I think there is a real yearning for it. But there, again, like outside of, religious and spiritual frameworks, where traditionally these questions were kind of held and young people were encouraged to think about what their calling is. I don't see anything kind of replacing that. Several years ago, I got involved in a project at the 92nd Street Y in New York City called the Ben Franklin Circles. And the Ben Franklin Circles were trying specifically to kind of create these small communities where people came together to talk about, Franklin's 13 virtues or whatever it was for leading a good life. And I ran one here in DC for a time of, just complete strangers kind of coming together, talking about these things. And it was so interesting to me how first of all, a group of strangers could come together and immediately form an intimate bond of community because we were kind of talking about these deeper issues. And second, how people use those conversations as places where they could kind of test ideas about, what they wanted to do in their own lives. And so I think there are kind of groups now that are trying to create the openings, but I didn't really experience that when I was in school.
That's so interesting, and it resonates with my experience as well. I was at a state university as an undergraduate, and it was all job training for the most part. Even the philosophy class, I remember, was focused on, getting a career. And then later, when I was a faculty member, I remember seeing a poster on the door of the philosophy department, and it said, "Climb the corporate ladder," and philosophy was going to be a pathway for this. And so what I've appreciated, and I'll just say this about Abigail Adams Institute, I've appreciated exploring the big questions in the Great Conversation series at the Abigail Adams Institute. And it's encouraged me to do more with that in my class that I teach at Harvard. And so I've become very interested and curious in exploring, how do we create a warm container like what you experienced growing up, that's comfortable for everyone, regardless of their background, and allows people to speak more fully from the heart, in a way that still engages with the core content of the course, but connects it to something that's personally meaningful. And I've found that incorporating contemplative practices, not just on your own as you're reading the book or whatever, but in the classroom, starting the class with writing haiku poetry about the topic or something like that, is really helpful. And I felt like we didn't have enough practices. It was sort of a passive experience of listening to lectures, and then you would debate each other in class, but there wasn't a process for connecting more deeply in silence, in a safe space. And we started thinking about, there's a college in California that has this motto, the pursuit of truth in the company of friends. And that's what it feels like when I'm at Abigail Adams. We're pursuing something, but there's a pleasantness about it. And it's not primarily a place where we want to outdo the other person, like in a chess match or something. It's not a competitive space. And so trying to model that in classes is sometimes a challenge. It's not necessarily what students are expecting. And what I liked about your book, and why I used it in my class some years ago, is that it provides a lot of practical opportunities to contemplate your best possible future self, or something like this. There's some activity that you can do. You're not just reading about it. What are some of your favorite activities to recommend that we might incorporate even in university classes?
Well, first of all, I think it's really awesome that you kind of incorporate contemplative practices in your class. And as you were speaking, it made me think that one place where you can create a warm container is in a classroom setting, and professors can be really instrumental in that. And even though as an undergrad, I didn't really experience that warm container, when I went to graduate school to study positive psychology, where all, at the center of that study were these big questions, it did feel that way. And so, so I'm grateful for that experience. In terms of kind of favorite practices, I mean, certainly, contemplative practices are very important to me. And that could be because I grew up, with meditators, but that's something that I try to incorporate in my life on a daily basis, because I mean, the world and our own minds can be such noisy places, and to take some time to kind of be quiet and ground ourselves. And I think that even to begin a class that way is so powerful, because I think that, and there's research that suggests that when we just kind of are able to be quiet for a few minutes, we can kind of reconnect with what our deeper values are. So we're not just kind of like running along, the surface of the water, but we can actually kind of connect more deeply. And so I think that it's kind of a constant reminder of meaning in your life to kind of engage in those contemplative practices. And it doesn't have to be meditation. It could be, going for a walk outside without your headphones on, things like that. I think even like, I write in my book about belonging as one of the pillars of meaning, having kind of a real encounter with another person where you're both tuned in, what Martin Buber called like an I thou connection, where you really treat the other person as, this kind of sacred thing, and your mind isn't somewhere else, but you guys are like really tuned into each other. I think that those kinds of experiences too can be forms of contemplative practice that can ground us and certainly bring lots of meaning to our lives.
And it would be great. I mean, looking back at my K through 12 and university and graduate school education, it would be great to have some practice, to use Buber's language, not just experiencing others as objects, but encountering them as sacred subjects, as fully realized human beings. And there was nothing about that process that I remember that used language like that, or that would have allowed us some ability to talk about how do we do that? What does that feel like to do that? And so this raises, I think, a question. We offered folks an opportunity to provide questions in advance of our conversation today. And several asked, what does meaning mean? Like when you talk about the power of meaning, we can get into the 4 pillars, but what do we mean by the word meaning?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And meaning is such a, vague kind of word and concept, but kind of looking at how philosophers and psychologists think about it and research it, there are a couple of kind of defining features. Like, the psychologist Martin Seligman and many philosophers say that a meaningful life is about connecting and contributing to something beyond yourself, whether that's your family or God or the work that you do, nature. There's this kind of self-transcendent component to it. And when people in kind of survey research tell psychologists that their lives are meaningful, it's because there are these 3 conditions that have been met. The first is that they feel a sense of significance and worth. Their lives are significant and worthy in some way. The second is that they believe their lives are driven by a sense of purpose. So some kind of goal or value that organizes your life and takes you into the future. And then finally, that they believe their lives make sense and are coherent. So their experiences don't feel random and disconnected, but things kind of come together in a larger whole.
Well, and on that point, I will put into the chat box now the Flourishing web app for everyone that's on our website. You can access it without any cost. And among other things on this in this web app, there's a new measure which my colleagues at the Human Flourishing Program, Jeff Hansen and Tyler Vanderweel, have developed, called the Comprehensive Measure of Meaning. And it's a short survey, but it gets at those domains that you just identified. So if anybody in the conversation today would like to self-assess, it's just answering the questions is a great process for self-reflection and self-understanding. And whatever you score on these questions, it's a great conversation starter with friends and family. And so invite others to take this. and perhaps work through the book and do some of the activities that are recommended and see how the scores might move over time. And so the point there is that there are practical steps that you can take, but it is helpful to have that kind of theoretical framework to understand, where am I stuck in terms of my sense of meaning? Which of these domains might I need some, to do some further reflection or maybe additional practice or conversation. And the other thing that I would suggest about the Flourishing app is that meaning and purpose is one of our domains of complete well-being, or what we call flourishing. And each of these domains relate to the others. And so if you have a higher sense of meaning and purpose, it might be because you have more satisfying social relationships, more of an I-thou kind of social relationship, to go back to Buber. It might be that you have been working on developing character, growing as a virtuous person. And so you can also self-assess on the different domains of flourishing and then see how meaning and purpose connect with the other domains. And as you point out, I think you refer to Roy Baumeister's article right at the beginning of your book. Sometimes meaning and happiness come from the same root, but they're distinct, and they may sometimes be inversely related. So the classic example is the parent who's up all night with a newborn. The emotional and physical health domain score might drop somewhat, and maybe even the happiness score drops, but there's a higher sense of meaning and maybe even some character virtue being developed there. So I think that's really helpful for us to think about how meaning connects with the other domains of well-being. And if you think about college students in particular, our research shows that there's multiple pathways to flourishing. And, certainly family is one, work is another, religious community. There's any number of these pathways, but education is important. And for college students who are focused more on the educational pathway, what can they do right now, today, to begin connecting with a more satisfying sense of meaning and purpose in life?
So in my book, I talk a little bit about the very kind of brief history of colleges in the United States and how traditionally places like Harvard, at their very center and the core of their mission was this idea that they would help students figure out what it meant to lead a good life. And the curriculum was kind of, based on that central question. And so students took classes in philosophy and, theology back when these schools were less secular. And then as they became more secular, in more kind of secular humanistic domains like literature, Shakespeare, there was this idea that by kind of studying these works where these great questions of human existence were at the center of them, by studying those works, you'd be able to reflect on your own life and kind of figure out for yourself, what it was that you wanted to do and what really mattered to you. I'm just thinking of, the novel Middlemarch, for example, how at the center of it, there are these kind of two central concerns. It's about, these young people as they're coming of age. One is, who do I want to spend the rest of my life with? And the second is, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? And those are arguably like the two most important questions that young people, as they move into, the real world, into kind of growing adulthood, will face and experience. And these works kind of, you encounter these questions, for yourself, and you kind of read your own life through them. And so this might just be a reflection of my own bias as a humanities lover and person, but I would say take as many humanities classes as you can, because those are the classes where you will be able to engage in these bigger questions. I mean, take Professor Lee's class as well, these places where you're given an opportunity, where you have that kind of warm cradle to think about, what it really is that matters to you.
Yeah, it's funny, at the beginning of fall semester, someone from the Harvard Gazette reached out to ask about my course and, how am I going to connect with Harvard's mission remotely, because Harvard was 100% online in the fall. And I didn't know what Harvard's mission was, so I went and looked it up. And it was framed mainly in terms of intellectual transformation, which of course is fine. It's not the development of the whole person, though. And so I wrote several paragraphs about this, none of which made it into the article, actually, about how, really it's about a more fundamental transformation than just the intellectual. And that's the connection with a deeper sense of meaning and purpose. When I first arrived at Harvard, some lovely folks at the Bureau of Study Council reached out to our program. And this part of Harvard had been going on for 7 decades, helping students connect with deeper meaning and purpose. And I went and presented at one of their meetings. And then after 70 years, they were shut down. And I thought, what a loss for the students who are at this important juncture in their lives as they're making decisions that are going to affect the path that they'll be on, and to not have that warm container to available to them for deeper reflection and really pursuing truth in the company of friends, supportive people who are after the same thing, not for instrumental purposes, but for its own sake. And so, I thought about the rather narrow mission, and the title of this book, which I hadn't read before, sprang to mind, and it turned out to have been written by a former Harvard dean, and it was called, I wrote it down here. Oh, yes, Excellence Without Soul.
Yeah.
And it was, I think, derived or the idea was that there was a chaplain at Harvard some years ago who said, our problem is we treat students like they're brains on a stick, but there's more, and especially left brains. If some of you may have seen Sir Ken Robinson's TED Talk, which is the most watched TED Talk, and he says, we basically educate the brain and slightly to one side. And so how, what would be, if we want to, maybe we should walk through the 4 pillars of meaning, and how might colleges create what you call in the book cultures of meaning? How might colleges be more effective in engaging with these 4 pillars? So belonging, purpose, storytelling, and transcendence. I always start my course with a storytelling exercise where students talk about the important events of their lives that have shaped who they are. And that's really foundational to everything else that we explore in the semester. And without that, I guess the neurosequential model that Bruce Perry developed says you have to regulate before you can relate. And then before you have to do that before you can reason. So sometimes we start out, we're dysregulated emotionally. And by telling our stories, we actually calm down, and that enables us to relate to each other. And then we're ready to reason. But I don't think enough attention is given to that neurosequential process. So when I think about your 4 pillars of meaning and how I've used them in my courses, I think that it moves us on that path of regulating so that we can relate to each other in an I thou way, and then we can start to reason or learn.
Yeah, no, that's so well put. And I love what you were talking about in terms of like the soul and the head on a stick idea of education. And I think that just as a way to kind of transition into the 4 pillars, there's so many different layers at which we can kind of make meaning. And one of those important layers when you're in college is at that soul level. So not just kind of developing your mind, but kind of trying to develop your soul and your spirit. And I think that probably that's a journey that students as individuals are going to have to undertake for themselves. I don't see colleges kind of, in our secular time kind of facilitating that, and maybe that's too pessimistic, but I think that just students kind of on their own, taking classes like yours, visiting whoever the chaplain is, making time for contemplative moments in their day. But then, in terms of the pillars, I'm kind of talking about meaning at a more psychological level. And, I'll just kind of walk through what these pillars are really quickly in case it's helpful, and then talk a little bit about how they kind of can be implemented in the cultures. But, the first pillar I mentioned briefly earlier is belonging. And this is really about, the connections that you have to others, but it's not just, it's not just kind of being in a relationship with someone else. We all have lots of relationships. It's really about being in a relationship where you feel valued for who you are intrinsically, and where you value the other person for who they are intrinsically. And it can kind of be a feature of a long-term, important, significant relationship, but it can also exist in moments between two people who are just, one is buying something from the other, or you run into somebody and you just kind of have like a nice encounter with them on the airplane or whatever. So this kind of pillar of belonging. The second is purpose, which I talked a little bit about earlier as well. And that's really about, what guides your life. Psychologists define it as a goal or a value that kind of orients your life, organizes your pursuits, and moves you into the future. And it can come in all shapes and sizes. I mean, you mentioned Professor Lee, children earlier. For many parents, their purpose is raising their children. When you're young, a lot of people have kind of grand idealistic purposes about changing the world in some way. So, it can kind of exist on these different spectrums. Transcendence is about contemplative moments where you're able to step outside of yourself and connect to something much bigger, much deeper. I mean, probably more than any other pillar, this is where, the soul gets activated. And I think that if those contemplative experiences in your class did kind of create that warmth for students to open up, I would venture to say that's because it wasn't activating, here, but it was activating like something deeper. So transcendence and meditation is a portal to transcendence. Nature, looking up at the sky at night. I write about stargazing in my book. Of course, many religious rituals, music, art. There are all kinds of ways that we can kind of have, an encounter with the sacred or with beauty. And when people do, they rate those experiences as among the most meaningful ones of their lives. So there's something really powerful about them. And those experiences, by the way, can shift our values too. So that our lives become more meaningful. There's a study where researchers kind of induced transcendence in a group of students by having them look up at these beautiful eucalyptus trees just for a minute. And then later on, when they were put in a situation, the students, where they could help somebody, they were more likely to help that person and to take more time helping that person. So it kind of can like shift your values. And then storytelling, finally, I think is one of the more important pillars, because, we don't always realize that when I'm talking about storytelling, I'm talking about kind of the story that we each are telling ourselves, about who we are, how we came to be that person. And we don't always realize that we have this kind of ongoing narrative in our minds about who we are and how we got to be that way. And a lot of times that story can be holding us back in some way. It can, be a story of, I'm not good enough, or I'm always failing, or I'll never find love, these kinds of things, and not kind of a story that can move us forward. So the psychologist Dan McAdams says that people who are leading meaningful lives, he studies kind of the narratives that people tell. The ones who report the most meaning in life tend to tell stories about their lives that are defined by themes of growth, redemption, and love. And the research suggests that we all have the capacity to tell those kinds of stories, even while respecting the facts of our lives. But it just has to do with how we kind of, where we put the magnifying glass on which kinds of experiences, on how we interpret those experiences. So those are kind of the pillars, just briefly. And I think that, colleges, or really any kind of culture, can weave these pillars into, the architecture of the place, so that people who are part of that culture, the students, can experience more meaning in life. I mean, Harvard, might consider a mission statement that's a little bit deeper than, kind of like intellectual transformation. And then that becomes the story of the school, and the story that the students and anyone who's part of that community can attach their own story to, kind of, finding a bigger story to kind of hitch your own onto, creating kind of cultures of belonging, where people really can kind of come together regardless of what they believe politically, religiously, in order to kind of see beyond those superficial differences into something deeper. These are some ways. And I think part of why the Sufi Meeting House experience was so powerful for me is because that kind of was a culture of meaning. And a lot of religious organizations, the pillars are just baked into what they do. People have a sense of purpose based on what the teachings are. They have a story about how the world came to be. They have community, they have opportunities for transcendence. And so it might be, those places might be models to us as we think of how we can create cultures of meaning in our own families and, schools and whatnot.
That's wonderful. And I think we can now turn it over to Gabby for questions from the group. But thank you so much for sharing. And, I'll just close by reflecting briefly on this article in the Atlantic a while back about workism. And maybe we're putting too much emphasis in terms of the meaning of our lives in work. And, this might relate to how colleges are organized to emphasize what we're going to do in our work careers rather than, the humanities and sort of the search for meaning more broadly. So if we think about the broader system, and as a sociologist, I always want to end with that, how do the colleges feed into the work culture, and then how does that culture, that broader culture, reflect the four pillars? And is that the best pathway relative to some of the other pathways for finding the deepest meaning in our lives? So thank you, Emily, and I'm happy to turn it back over to Gabby now.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that great conversation. I'm very excited to open the floor for questions as well as comments. I think one of my biggest impressions as an undergrad is just the emphasis that both of you place on the contemplative practices and just generally slowing down, which I think is not something that's embedded in the Harvard culture or just general college culture. And so I think that is a really great lesson to keep in mind as we move into hopefully at least somewhat slower period of summer for some of us not being in classes, and especially going back into school for the fall semester. So I appreciated that. I'd like to invite any undergrads who are here right now, if you'd like to ask a question live, feel free to either raise your hand physically on camera or use the raise hand feature. You can also throw a question into the chat if you'd like as well.
And Gabby, while folks are typing, would you like me to read one of the questions that we received by email? Because I know it takes a moment to get thoughts together. So
yeah, I think that's a good way to start.
So,
yeah,
somebody wrote that that as a parent of college-age young adults, I watch them struggle, given that they lack some level of hope for the future. They're disenchanted, disillusioned with the current state of the world, and this is government and social and other, otherwise. How can parents help our young adult children find meaning when they don't see a better future for the world? So I think this speaks to McAdams' work about, we don't want to get stuck in a contamination story. That's my memory, that there's like chaos and contamination. And what I liked, Emily, about your book is that you, near the end, you talk about people who have terminal cancer diagnoses and their time is limited. And a doctor said, well, I wasn't trained to do this, but I'm going to create an 8-week process to help people see the meaning and the potential and the opportunities that are present, even though their time is very limited. And that really had profound transformative effects. So I wonder if you could say more about a story of hope rather than contamination and chaos, which seems to be the media cycle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's actually kind of shameful how the media does create that story, and they do it for, because it gets clicks and makes the money. And this is something that we talk a lot about in the positive psychology world, is there's so much focus on bad news out there, and there's very little focus on all the good that's happening in the world. And it creates a very lopsided picture that that interacts with a problem in our own way of thinking, which we, anyone who wants to kind of lead a good life has to kind of actively work to overcome, which is that we have a very strong negativity bias. And so when bad things happen to us, we remember it, and it kind of imprints itself on us far more strongly than when good things happen. And this happens to such an extent that in relationships, if you want to have a healthy, happy relationship, you have to have 5 good things happen for every 1 bad thing, because the bad so poisons the well. And so as we think about the kind of stories that we're telling about our lives and about the future, what this suggests is that we're kind of hyper focused on the negative in a way that blinds us to the greater goodness that's out there in the world. And narrative therapists, narrative psychologists would say, you're kind of focusing on these data points that are also negative, and then kind of weaving a storyline that's kind of negative from those data points. What about all these other data points out there that are, can be part of the story that you're not incorporating into that storyline? And so I think, those kinds of ways of thinking can help people craft a more hopeful story. And I think one thing, just thinking about the state of the world, is maintaining some perspective. Obviously we all went through a really difficult period this past year, unprecedented. For some people, it was much harder than for others. But nothing hard lasts forever. And that's kind of one of the central teachings within psychology. If you're talking to somebody who's depressed or suicidal, it's reminding them that, pain doesn't last forever. And I think that in itself is a source of hope. Another source of hope is that we know that most people, when they go through experiences of adversity, grow as a result of them. And so, it might feel hard now, but there is kind of something on the other side that, might redeem what makes things harder now. And then finally, really taking the big perspective, the world, by nearly every measure has gotten objectively better over the course of history. You're much more likely today to live in a society that respects basic human rights. You're much less likely to die of kind of a violent death. All these ways that the world is getting better. Every year, millions and millions of people are lifted out of poverty. I mean, it's extraordinary. And so I think kind of maintaining that bigger perspective can be a source of hope too.
Yeah, and I really loved, I think it was an IBM executive that you talked about in the book who, was dealing with, this difficult diagnosis, but connecting with abundance more intentionally through this storytelling process, not just noticing the scarcity, but noticing the abundance. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. And she was somebody who was, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and in the immediate aftermath of her diagnosis, kind of concluded that her life was meaningless, that there was nothing left to live for. I think she said, when I got that diagnosis, I just wanted to jump into the grave. But then, she started going through this 8-week meaning-centered psychotherapy program where basically she was taught to do a lot of the things that we're talking about now, kind of storytelling and thinking about her purpose and stuff. And, reflecting on kind of just ordinary sources of meaning in her life. She talks about seeing a beautiful statue at an art museum as, being one of the highlights of her life. And those kinds of reflections got her to eventually shift her perspective completely on the meaning of her life. So it's not this grand thing that you have to do. It can just be these smaller reflections.
Great.
Awesome. If anyone has a question, feel free to keep raising hands or putting questions in the chat. Another one that was submitted in advance is sort of just, what is, it's a big question, but what is the purpose of Harvard education and perhaps higher education in general? And I think back to your discussion of a transformative experience, which is something that it's almost a meme among the Harvard undergrads because we hear it so often at welcome speeches and graduation speeches and all those kinds of things. So, what does it look like to be transformed throughout these 4 years? And what is the relationship between that transformation and developing a sense of meaning and what it's all for?
I think, Yeah, I mean, I see a lot of, places kind of using some of these terms almost as buzzwords, whether it's the term purpose or transformation, and it can ring hollow. And I think that it can create also like really big expectations for people as they move through, for example, the college experience on what it's supposed to be. And one of the things that I try to do in my book is kind of take meaning off of its pedestal so that it doesn't seem like this grand, unreachable thing, but something that we can access every single day just by the way we see the world, by the way we interact with others. And so I would maybe kind of not, I would hope that yes, like a college experience is transformative, but if it's not transformative, that's okay too. And sometimes the transformation can occur over a much longer period than those 4 years in college. Maybe college is just where it begins. And I think of college as a time of, self-discovery. And that's a process that goes on for all of our lives, not just for 4 years. I mean, for me, a big part of my own journey was discovering positive psychology and the kind of, research that Professor Lee does, the Human Flourishing program and things like that. And that didn't occur until I was 5 years out of school. And I'm still kind of on that journey now, getting a PhD in psychology. So it can kind of, the ways that we transform aren't always like, dramatic, and they can occur over, a long period of time. So I think kind of approaching this period of life with patience for yourself too, and kindness, and just continuing that self-exploration, without getting kind of thrown off course by some of these siren songs of like workism and things like that is, how I think of what the purpose of a college education is.
Well, and if I could just add briefly to that, from the perspective of a faculty member, I would say to students that, engage your faculty in conversations about issues of deeper meaning and how you want that to be included in the class. Like if it comes from the students, then it's easy to do. But I remember some years ago when I was still at the University of Akron, I was part of this experiential learning center, and we were creating these things called unclasses because they were so countercultural. And I remember, doing some of these things and sort of feeling like I was looking over my shoulder for some dean to put a stop to it or something. But we had special permission all the way up from the provost because we were part of this group that we could do these things. And I think that students can empower faculty to dig deeper into some of these issues. Just raise it in office hours. And I've had students suggest things to me that I thought, oh yes, that's much better than what I had planned. Let's do that thing. And I remember, I'll just mention this about Gabby's student discussion group. So the Bureau of Study Council no longer exists, but rather than curse the darkness, we can light a candle. And so, Gabby lit a candle and started inviting students to explore questions of friendship and flourishing and leadership, and have some, common reading to discuss. And, why not fold that into a class? Because we're all so busy and students are so busy, it's difficult to make time for these things, but why not integrate it? So we can create structures like the Experiential Learning Center that I was associated with in universities to do some of these experiments and not have to worry about deans shutting them down. But if students ask for it, the universities will respond.
Absolutely. Another question submitted. How do students find meaning in spaces that weren't designed for us, or in pathways that we were perhaps pressured into by family or different norms or expectations?
That's a great question. I think, one of the things that I talk a little bit about in my book is, when you find yourself kind of stuck in a job, let's say, that isn't what your dream job, what you thought you would want to do in your dream job. And, there's two ways, well, there's many ways to kind of cope with that, but there are kind of two obvious ways to cope with it as I see it. One is you leave the job, or you try to find meaning within the job. And there's a lot of really interesting research on how people do the latter. I'm thinking of a study where, it looked at people kind of working in various administrative roles who all, their calling was to be, artists or, teachers or, things like that, things that felt a little bit more, glamorous perhaps, or meaningful, but that they couldn't do that because of practical life circumstances. And what they did instead was they found ways to kind of express aspects of their calling in their current job. So what, one person wanted to be a performer and he couldn't do that. And so in his administrative role, there was some kind of teaching element to it. So he used that as like a stage for his kind of performance and making people laugh and become engaged. Another woman talked about how working with children was her dream. Again, she was in a role where she didn't do that, but she used her time outside of work to volunteer at Ronald McDonald House. And so, there are ways that we can kind of find meaning or make up for the lack of meaning in the things that we do. I think when you're young, though, it is early enough. You don't have to worry about supporting a family yet. To switch courses too, and to kind of, walk your own path, especially, parents are so well-meaning and they just want to see their kids kind of thrive and flourish in the world. But sometimes if they can be overbearing in what they want you to do, you who are an adult. And so ultimately it's your life. And so kind of getting off of a path that doesn't feel right for you, I think is an option that can make a lot of sense, especially if you're kind of in those college years.
Yeah, I would just add very briefly, a few students and I wrote this paper in the Journal of Transformative Education that just came out in December. And we talk about classes that teach you to play by the rules, or classes that teach you to question the rules, which is sort of the contemplative process. And then classes that teach you to create new rules or a completely new game. And that's the transformative class. And so we can be more intentional about preparing to play the games that already exist. And we need to do that. It's practical, but we can reflect on why they're set up that way. And then we can begin to imagine what is it like to be a social entrepreneur and begin to co-create new rules and perhaps even a new game. I think we can be working on these all three at the same time. It's a little bit potentially unrealistic or unhelpful just to be creating new games all the time, because we have to plug in. But our program, the Human Flourishing program, we have some research on job crafting. And this is something that a worker can start, or there can be a conversation with, the boss and the worker. And so there's ways to be more creative here, but you're still working within a framework. And so, how to discern when to be realistic and when to be visionary, that could be part of the educational journey.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, that there is this kind of balance between idealism and practicality, and the games that you have to play and the games that you make, or however you put it. That's great.
Touching back on the pillar of belonging, we had another question submitted. How does one best foster connections with the people around them, those that agree, disagree, those that are closest to you, those that are strangers, and the world at large, the earth, nature, a nation, or populations far away?
So the kind of key feature of belonging, is I talked a little bit about earlier, is kind of valuing another person for who they are intrinsically. This idea that there is kind of something inherently valuable and sacred in the other, and I think that's an attitude we can bring to our communities, to nature as well. And when we bring that attitude, I think it kind of automatically fosters connection, because then we come to an encounter or to a bond or a relationship, curious about the other, really kind of listening to the other instead of trying to, push an agenda or, directing the conversation. So there is the kind of this outward focus that is so much on the other. I think it sounds simple, but it's actually really hard to accomplish. But when we do, that's kind of where the belonging lives.
Such an interesting question, or interesting discussion. I have a question about how we adjudicate between different kinds of meaning. because we all can imagine people, or maybe know people, who find meaning in very trivial things, devote an entire life to collecting toys or something like that, or even in kind of malevolent purposes, like joining extremist groups or something like that. So how do we decide which kinds of meaning are worth pursuing, and which kinds are?
I mean, that's a great question. I think it's a moral question and a philosophical question. And I think that, I don't consider myself a moral authority. And so my sense is that everyone has to kind of answer that question on their own. I think that just from a practical perspective, my sense is that most people are answering that question in more kind of benevolent ways than malicious ways. So that's good, but that doesn't mean that there aren't these very problematic ways that people can find meaning in, gangs, cults, organizations like ISIS. Certainly Hitler thought that what he was doing was meaningful. And I think that, at bottom, when I think about the defining feature of a meaningful life, to connect and contribute to something beyond yourself, there's kind of a spirit of love and benevolence and generosity there. And so to the extent that, our meaning is coming from that spirit, or the cultures of meaning that we're building are trying to bring out the best in people instead of the worst in people, the way more negative cultures of meaning do, I think that's a sign that those are the kind of meanings that we want to build and create.
Yeah, that's great. And I see my colleague Jeff is with us as well. So Emily, Jeff's an expert on Kierkegaard, so we could have a little Kierkegaard seminar on this question. But certainly Kierkegaard recognized that we pursue happiness, but despair lurks in some forms of happiness. So which ones to pursue? And so we could talk about the aesthetic level, the ethical level, the religious level. And there's different ways to evaluate these pursuits. I think, and I'll put this in the chat box as well. We have an event on May 25th. Gabby will be presenting, among others in our community of practice, on education as regenerative space. And so something is regenerative when it starts to heal the harm that we see in the world. So many of the world's life support systems are in decline. And so it's not enough just to not do further damage. We have to begin to heal that. Many workers are disengaged and burned out. So it's not enough just to sort of address depression and leave people languishing. And on it goes. There's any number of surveys that can tell us we're not at the optimal level yet. And so how do we create a regenerative space, and what does that look like? I think it's ultimately, I think back to September 11th, and this was a source of great despair for many people. And I remember thinking, how do you make sense of this? And I remember an interview with the children's television host, Mr. Rogers, and somebody said to him, "What are we going to tell the children?" And he said, "Tell them to keep their eye on the helpers." There's a lot more helpers than there are people who would harm life. There's more people trying to nurture life. And so there's something inherently truthful about helping and about nurturing life and helping life to grow that helps us discern. So I think it is helpful to go back to Kierkegaard's framework and look at these different levels, but we can do something even more basic and fundamental and ask the question, is this harmful to life, or is this ultimately regenerative? And why is this not a more commonplace conversation among educators? Is our educational process regenerative or fundamentally extractive? I do a one-word check-in at the beginning of all my classes, just one word about your emotional experience right now. And oftentimes two-thirds or more of the students are drained or grieving or just exhausted, something negative. And these are the best years of life. You're young and you're at this wonderful place. And if we did more than educate a brain on a stick, you might not be so tired all the time. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I want to jump in. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. One of our attendees today asked in the chat, if you were looking for meaning, where should you start?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, one thing you might try to do is ask yourself, of those pillars that I described, is there one that really resonates most with you? And one thing I should have probably said when I was talking about the pillars is that you don't necessarily need to have like every single one to a full extent in your life in order for your life to feel meaningful. Some people are going to rely more on one than another, and so maybe figuring out for yourself like what really matters most to you, and then building that particular pillar in your life. And I also think it's such a personal question. Like everyone's going to have a different answer to that. For me, maybe it's because I love books and writing and stuff. When I'm looking for meaning, one of the places that I explore is through reading, because learning new things, that's kind of I think for me. For other people who are more social, it's going to be kind of connecting with others. So I think part of it is just kind of knowing yourself well enough to know what's going to turn you on and enliven you, like Professor Lee was talking about.
Yeah, I remember reading a statement of purpose as part of a graduate school application. I review these things, and the students basically said, well, I'm broken, but I'm going to fix the world, to get to the, sum it up. And I thought, well, rather than only turning that pain and suffering outward and trying to save the world, why don't we explore, mutual liberation together? Like, let's find a pathway where we're not suppressing what it is we've experienced, but we use that as the fuel for our own growth and knowledge, and in the company of friends who are also walking that path, because nobody wants to be fixed. Here comes a do-gooder to fix me. I don't want that. I don't want to be, and that's really treating someone as an object. Going back to Buber, if we recognize that we're all on this journey, and we all need to learn, and we need to give back, but we also need to receive, I think we can start building a more meaningful path right away.
You've been mentioning reading and some of these good authors and books that are helpful in finding meaning. If you could give us a few recommendations, what are some of the best books or authors for people to check out to start reading more about finding meaning in life?
Mm-hmm. I think the book Man's Search for Meaning is a really good place to start, by Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor. It's about his experiences in the concentration camp and the importance of finding meaning during suffering and how that can make you resilient. The other one I'll mention, I already mentioned briefly, is Middlemarch. I think that novel is like the perfect novel to read when you're in college and thinking about the future and kind of the big decisions of your life. And what I love about it is that it just has a very humane conclusion about what a meaningful life is ultimately about. So I would recommend those too.
Yeah, I would second both of those, and I would just share, and I'll put in the chat, this book on the science of abundance, written by a member of our community of practice, who founded the Institute for Strategic Clarity, which around the world has identified high-performing organizations and helped them become even more effective at what they do. And what Jim, the author, finds is that if you have deep clarity about how you make a specific contribution to a deeper shared purpose, then you're going to be much more engaged. You're going to see abundance everywhere. You're going to have a sense of meaning. And if there's not a process within your groups, it could be your family, it could be your workplace, it could be your class, your classroom. If there's not a process to help you clarify your specific contribution to a vibrant space of trust that produces a deeper shared purpose, then we need to redesign that container. And so this book is about redesigning the containers so that we can better connect with ourselves and others, and a deeper sense of truth and perhaps creative spirit.
Awesome. And of course, definitely recommend Emily's book, The Power of Meaning, as well as Matt's book that's available as a free download, Measuring Wellbeing, which has a number of chapters about meaning and flourishing and all sorts of other topics too. Mm-hmm. Okay, so with that, I will wrap up the event. Thank you so much again to Matt Lee, Emily Esfahani Smith, and our sponsors, the Abigail Adams Institute, the Human Flourishing Program, the Harvard Philosophy Department, and the World Youth Alliance. It's been so great to have this conversation, and I hope it's one that continues outside of this Zoom call with those in your life and in your own personal reflections. There's also a number of resources, events, and different opportunities that were in the chat. So you can take a look at those, and we can send those out as well as the recording at the end. So thank you all so much for being here today.